All right, I think we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Baltimore Region Transit Governance and Funding Study Public Forum. This is our second public meeting in this study effort, and we're looking forward to speaking with you over the next hour to hour and a half to talk through our agenda tonight, which is to present potential options for new governance models for the Baltimore region. I'm going to start with our welcome. My name is Amy Patine. I'm a principal with Nelson Nygaard, which is the consulting firm leading this effort. I'm also joined tonight by Bethany Whitaker, who's the project manager, also a principal with Nelson Nygaard, and Fred Fravel from KFH Group, who has been a part of the consulting team. And also Don Halligan, who's a senior transportation planner with the Baltimore Metropolitan Council and has been our point person on the public side. So we're excited to be with all of you tonight. We've got a full agenda to cover as we lead up to presenting new governance models. And I'll just go over that quickly. So welcome. Then we're going to go over our study goals. So again, what we set out to accomplish through this effort. Then we're going to spend some time just going through the study steps. This has been a roughly 6-month effort to date, and so we want to recap what we've learned along the way. And then we're going to turn and talk about what's driving change. So as we set that stage, we're then going to talk about what are the reasons that we are looking into new models of governance for the Baltimore region. And then from there, we'll get specific. We'll share some ideas about new ways to fund and invest in transit in the region. We'll also be presenting potential governance models that again have come out of this effort, and then we'll talk about next steps. And all of you are live streaming this effort through public input. We are here on Zoom, but if you were at our first forum, you're familiar with this process. We want to hear from you. We do have staff from our team on the public input side as well, monitoring the chat. We encourage you to leave comments and questions throughout. If there are questions we can easily answer, we will via chat. Otherwise, there will be time at the end for us to address your comments in the public forum. In addition to the chat, you can also text your thoughts to the number here on the screen. You can leave us a voicemail as well at the extension 4606, or you can email us your comments. And the other kind of new addition to this forum, which we didn't do with the last one, is we really want to make this interactive and make sure that we take time to hear your comments. So I know we're all familiar with our virtual meeting world and some of the different tools and interactive opportunities that are out there. We'd like to use one tonight. It's called Menti. So maybe some of you are familiar with Menti, but there's a couple of ways to log in. And so you can use your phone, hold it right up to the screen and scan that QR code, and it'll take you to our Menti site. Or you can open, if you're watching on your laptop or tablet, you can open a second browser window and go to menti.com and then enter the code 554259. And I'd ask that you either keep that browser window open on your, again, tablet, computer, laptop, or you keep it open on your phone. There's about 6 questions we're going to ask you tonight. And again, these are going to be spread out throughout the presentation. And it just gives us a chance to make sure that everyone out there is able to participate and provide feedback. So lots of feedback channels tonight. And so I will send these orange prompt slides for in case people join us throughout the evening and they didn't catch that news up front. But before each question, we'll have this slide here where, again, you can rescan the QR code or, again, go to menti.com and enter code 554259. So hopefully people have had a chance to go ahead and scan that QR code or go to the website. And to make sure, as part of our intro, we'll do a couple of warm-up questions. These will be live responses. And again, these are anonymous. We do not know who is responding, so feel free to answer freely. And the first question is, what brought you here tonight? And we get a few choices. I love transportation, learn about the study, understand priorities for the region and the study team, share your feedback with us, which we hope you do. Ask a question if you've been, maybe read about this study or heard about it and would like to get clarification, or maybe there's another reason. And I know we had a few individuals register for tonight, so I know there's a lot of folks out there, so I'm going to give it a minute and just give you a second to weigh in. We've gotten 6 responses so far, so I know at least 6 people were able to get that QR code. Or again, you can go to menti.com and use the code 554259. You're certainly not required to give feedback to us this way, but again, it's another avenue for us to hear your thoughts, make sure that we're collecting as much feedback as possible on this process. And again, that public input chat box is also open for you to provide comments and questions throughout. So about 7 responses, which is a good number, but I'm hoping that a few more folks will log on. Again, this is one of the easier upfront questions. They're going to get a little more robust and related to the study as we move on.
I think there's 28 people signed up, so just
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Or participating, I should say. More than that signed up. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was our first question. Let me switch it and we'll try a different one. And thank you for those of you who were able to log in and respond. And again, we'll share the code again, but you can see it also at the top of the slide here, menti.com 554259. And just another get to know you question. What part of the Baltimore region do you call home? These are the counties in the city that are included in this study that we've been looking at the transit services provided and including in our potential alternatives and as we think through new funding and governance models. So let us know where you're from so we can hopefully get some good representation across the region. Okay.
Getting a few more now.
Getting a few more. All right, well, those are our warm-up questions. So again, I'll be showing that QR code when we get to the next portion of the presentation. I don't want to hold us up too much, but encourage you. It's really simple. Again, this is anonymous. We do not know who is saying what. Oh, good. We got a couple more for this one. So we're up to 9 responses. And your feedback is really critical. So please continue to participate again in all the ways that I've already outlined. And if you're having any technical difficulties, we do have staff manning that chat line as well as all the other ways that I mentioned earlier. So happy to help for anyone who may need assistance. I'll just make one more note. These questions for anyone who either could not participate in them live or want to share them with a friend, we will be sharing them as part of a post survey that'll go out and be posted on the BRTB website afterwards. So there will be another opportunity to provide comments to these in responses to the questions that we're posing tonight. Great. Well, thank you for those of you who participated. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Bethany to talk about study goals.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. So you can go ahead to the next slide. I'm just going to take a minute. So welcome, everybody. My name is Bethany Whitaker, as Amy mentioned. I'm the project manager for the study. I'm just going to take a minute and go over the study goals, like what we set out to do as the project team, some of the key terms, and some of the primary goals that we heard from the stakeholders and throughout the data collection part of the project. So just to kind of recap, I think you may have seen, if you participated in the first public forum, you have seen some of this material already. But this project, as Amy mentioned, we had about 6 months to do it. The main tasks associated with the project were first to inventory the way that transit governance and funding is done in the Baltimore region today. So how do we organize and structure and fund and support public transit systems in the Baltimore region? Then we evaluated those structures. So what are some of the things that worked really well about them? What are areas where they work less well? And then we use that information to identify some different ways that transit service could be governed and funded. And that's where we are tonight. We're going to present those draft models. So the next slide, just I think the terms governance and funding, they're terms that we use a lot, and I think we generally know what we're talking about, but I just wanted to take a step back and go over them for a minute. So when we're talking about transit governance, what we're really talking about is three things. One is authority. So what authority do you have to do something, and where did you get that authority? Did it come from the taxpayers? Did it come from the state legislature? Did it come from the state assembly? And then with that authority, what are you responsible? What are you supposed to be doing with that authority? And then how do you share and make decisions? So if you're setting out to implement transit service, who are you responsible to? The people that live in the Baltimore region. And then how do you share decisions about those, about how transit service invested, where the bus goes, where there's bus stops, things like that. And then similarly for funding, some of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about funding is, what is the source of that fund? So where is it being raised and how is it being raised? And what are some of the important things about that funding source? So some of the things that we looked at, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but is it a durable source? Does it raise enough money? Is it an equitable source? And then what does that funding source, what responsibility does that tie you to? The people who are paying into that funding, and then who's benefiting from it? And then of course, decision making is a key part of that. So how do you share decisions among everybody who's paying into it? And do you make those, do you share those decisions based on who needs service the most, for example, or maybe who's paying into it the most? So these are some of the things that we considered and talked about as we developed the model. And then I just have one more slide that I'm going to briefly talk about. Especially when we started this project and we talked to people about transit governance and funding, we asked them, why do this, right? It's a big lift. It's a difficult thing to do, to change the way that you're structured and change the way you're funded over time. And so we asked people why it was important and what are some of the things that a new governance and funding model could accomplish. And the things that that people told us, including some of you, that the important things were, one, to improve the coordination between service, to improve the quality of service overall, to make sure that people could travel around the region seamlessly in other than driving. And then of course there was a bucket of goals and objectives that were really related to governance funding, like increasing the amount of money that's being spent on transit, making sure decisions are made equitably, that we're investing in transit in an equitable way, and that there's transparency and understanding about how decisions are made. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fred for, there's a poll question.
There's
Sorry,
a poll
Amy.
question. That's okay. We'll keep practicing. So for those of you who are just joining us, I explained this briefly at the outset, but we are, in addition to public input in the chat box and other ways, email and voicemail that you can communicate with us, we are doing live Menti polling. So again, if you scan this QR code on your smartphone or tablet, or open a new browser in your window and go to menti.com, that's menti.com, and enter the code 554259, you can join us live for our polling questions. And again, there's about 4 more questions, I think, throughout, again, the presentation, because we are looking for any and all ways to have you participate and give us your thoughts and feedback. So the first couple of questions, again, we're just more get to know you questions. And so before we go into the next section, again, Bethany just gave an overview of the study goals that were defined and set at the outset. And so again, we just want to hear from you. Let us know which project goal is most important to you to help, kind of affirm and prioritize and get those thoughts from the public. Again, these are anonymous polling questions. We have no idea who is responding. And it's really for us to just get that, again, finger on the pulse of where people's minds and thoughts are at with respect to what goals are most important to the public in the region. You can select one and hit submit. You can rank them 1 through 6 and choose multiple answers. The choice is yours to decide what you want to put a value on. And we can see here, again, this is live polling, so you can see that they are shifting as people place their votes. So if you've got a favorite, right now, ensure equitable investment is getting the most votes. followed by improved quality of service. Coordination is at the bottom. Again, not to say that these goals aren't all important, but again, it's just helpful to get that feedback from the broader public and the participants tonight to hear what is on your mind. I'll give it just another minute. And again, if anyone is having technical difficulty, feel free to let us know in the chat box in the public input page, and we can help you out. And these questions will also go out after the meeting. And if you did not participate tonight, you can still provide your thoughts or send the link to someone who couldn't make it tonight and they can provide their thoughts as well. So now improved quality of services. Yep, still in the lead. And again, thank you for those of you who have gone ahead and logged into Menti or scanned that QR code. We really want everyone to participate if they can. Okay, great. Well, it looks like improved quality of service, but votes for all of our goals. But good feedback, so thank you. Thank you for participating. There'll be other opportunities, so again, log in and take part. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Fred Fravel, who's going to talk about the study steps.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Fred Fravel. I'm with the KFH group, and I'm going to just kind of walk you through some of the steps we went through to get to where we are in the project today. Bethany kind of alluded to the general structure, but we've been through 8 tasks basically to get us to the point where we are. We started out by looking at the basically kind of covering what the study was about with the BRTB. We looked at the history of MDOT and MTA and the lots in the region. How did we get to where we are? What is the current structure? What is the current financial situation? We looked at peer agencies and transit systems in other places, and we've looked at transit funding in the region and around the country for some ideas that could be applied in Baltimore. For each step, we presented at a BRTB meeting, and there's a tech memo and a presentation, and I think you can access those through the BRTB website if you want to go back and catch up on these things. So we're now at the point of really developing and presenting the governance and funding options. Next slide. This was a lot of fun, creating both all of this information and this graphic. But early on, we wanted to get at the question of how did we end up with the current state role in providing, supporting transit in the Baltimore region. And one of the things we found out that's very interesting, I won't go through all of these steps, I would love to, but basically, an interesting thing about Maryland is that the state role is very historic, that it goes way back to the beginning of the State Roads Commission. The state has had a historic role in creating infrastructure and also in regulating transportation services, including local transit, for example, in Baltimore. And so kind of from that history and that tradition, as we went through time, we got up to 1970 when the Maryland Department of Transportation was formed as a multimodal transportation agency that really included highways, transit, aviation, toll roads, ports, and everything. So these are some of the key things. Kind of after 1970, there were a number of developments as the role of MTA expanded to cover more modes and a broader geographic coverage with its statewide programs. Next slide, Amy. Now, we've just been through a little exercise that's very similar to what's on this page, but early in the study process, we did the same kind of thing. because we were interested in sort of seeing how stakeholders, what we needed to look at when we were looking at the existing structure and its issues. And this is very similar to what you just saw, but it's very much an interest in more and higher quality services, the regional connectivity, a desire for more investment in transit. The regional approach in decision making was a key factor at the very beginning of the process and still is. And also how and why decisions get made and making those more predictable and transparent. So these initial stakeholder inputs were used as we were looking at the existing structure and then as we began to develop options. Next slide. Now, I think probably most of the stakeholders here are quite familiar with the basic structure of transit services in the Baltimore region. There's really kind of three kinds of services that intersect and overlap. There's the commuter regional services, MARC trains, and the commuter bus services that are managed by MTA, funded through the Transportation Trust Fund. There's what we call the Baltimore core services, the local bus, light rail, subway, and paratransit, managed by MTA, generally operated by MTA. And then we have the locally operated transit systems. There are 8 of them in the region, and they are partially funded through a number of different funding programs through MTA. And they are operated, though, by the local entities, either directly operated or contracted out. Now, these different transit programs, they fit into the overall state of Maryland MDOT operating structure. So I mentioned that MDOT is a multimodal entity. There are a number of business units that are fundamentally kind of modally oriented. And the transit business unit is the Maryland Transit Administration, MTA, and it covers the operating factors that I mentioned in the earlier slide before. I did want to mention one quick thing, though, is while transit is a business unit and all of those transit programs are part of MTA, Maryland's transit programs that address the Washington region are run from the Secretary's office and are not under MTA. Next slide. The budgeting process, we spent a fair amount of time on this task trying to unpack how the Transportation Trust Fund works, where the funding comes from, and how the operating, how it results in an operating budget for MTA, and that MTA's capital budget is basically part of the 6-year Capital Transportation Program, the CTP budgeting process. And the Transportation Trust Fund is multimodal, and it is in effect kind of sets the size of the pie that needs to be split up among all of the various business units. Now, MTA can put in requests for its operating budget. Its capital program is really developed through the CTP. The real priorities in the budget are really meeting the debt service, maintenance of effort to keep up the existing services, meeting the contractual commitments, including any kind of annual increases, and only then really addressing any additional emerging needs. So it's really been devoted to trying to maintain what we've got and work within the overall Transportation Trust Fund budget. Next slide. Now, we looked at the overall transit investment in the Baltimore region, just so everybody gets a sense of the relative magnitude between the Baltimore core services, the locally operated transit services, and the commuter bus and MARC services. And basically the entire budget in 2019 anyway came up to about 1.1 billion. The lots, if you do a map, the lots look like they're providing a lot of the coverage, but in a budget sense, they're a small part of this overall budget expenditure. They're about 41 million. And you can see that there's basically 304 million in capital that goes into the system as well. So there's a lot of money. This basically is state funding provided through the Transportation Trust Fund, except for the local match that the locally operated transit systems provide for the money that MTA provides to them. Next slide. One of the things we tried to do that I hadn't seen done before was try and understand really what the investment by jurisdiction is. And this is a little more complicated because we know that MTA core services, that there's a lot of service provided in Baltimore County. And so, for example, Baltimore County is not just the locally operated transit system. It has the Baltimore core services, and there's other MTA commuter rail services. Same kind of thing in Anne Arundel. So we were trying to understand, once we spread the MTA operated or contracted services out across the region, what's the relative overall transit investment? And again, Baltimore City clearly has a significant share. Baltimore County is also a major part of the overall investment in the region, and Anne Arundel County, particularly through a lot of commuter rail service that, if you allocate it by revenue mile, falls into that. Less so for the other counties in the region. Hartford and Howard each have their own locally operated transit systems, but that overall investment is kind of dwarfed by the investment in the city of Baltimore. Next slide. So that's kind of our basic understanding of where we started out. We tried to understand how the current structures are. And now Amy is going to talk about, given all of that, what's really driving the need for change. Amy?
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, so before we turn to talk about new funding opportunities and new potential models for governance, just to kind of put a cap on the study work to date that Fred just summarized. We talked about the goals, and we went over the history and structure and financing of transit in the region today. So why change things, right? Change is not easy, so why do it? Well, we know that Maryland is somewhat unique. It's one of the few states, it's one of a handful of states with, again, a major metropolitan area like the Baltimore region that doesn't have a local or regional authority, but the state is playing a critical role in providing services. So, again, to summarize, we see some strengths and weaknesses. For the Baltimore core services that are overseen by MDOT MTA, we've heard concerns that there's limited local or regional input, but also conversely, there's limited financial responsibility or obligation, which can be difficult to raise local funding from new or shift it from existing resources. And the state does provide that sustained, predictable funding source at the state level. But the Baltimore, again, core region and counties do have a desire to have more input into local decision making. And with that comes, potential opportunity to increase transit funding sources as well. And then with the lots agencies, those are locally governed and funded. So there is kind of the inverse of that, more local control over service development. However, because there are multiple systems in the region, what we've seen is that while staff are coordinating to some extent, there is limited interaction between the systems amongst each other, and then with the Baltimore core services, which prevents this larger desired goal for improved regional coordination. So there are some good things, but there also are some challenges that are preventing some of these desires and not taking advantage of these opportunities. So again, due to all these factors, there's today limited avenues to improve the quality of transit and to address those goals that we identified at the beginning of the study, and really a lack of incentives to increase or improve coordination between the different systems. So, as we look to new models, we're looking at how might a change to existing infrastructure or governance increase local input and also create a mechanism to increase funding. Another component of the study was we looked at lessons from other regions. And as we looked at peers, we looked at places that have been successful at identifying new funding or have what's to be considered a good, decision-making model, but also places that have, faced similar challenges to the Baltimore region. Many of these peers have strong participation from their state government, both for investment as well as decision making. And we do foresee the state of Maryland to still continue to play a critical role in supporting funding transit in the region. So that was one thing that we were looking to learn of how to do that successfully and balance multiple perspectives. Just quickly, some of the other key themes we identified from our peer review. Again, the need to strike the right balance of representation and influence from the city and county, and state level. Again, with that role, the goal of regional representation and then coordination between systems. We learned from other successful places that stakeholder and public input and just general transparency is critical to ensure buy-in, and just to make sure that there is proper representation both geographically as well as a diversity of perspectives at the table. And this will also be critical if new funding measures are going to be pursued. And then the peers taught us some good lessons about thoughtful board representation, including having individuals who have direct lines to local and state leadership to ensure that transit is front and center and a key priority. And that governance and funding cannot be fully separated. Influence is often tied to level of resources, but resources also have to come at all levels, the federal, the state, and the local. And then just lastly, local dedicated funding is really the best way to ensure that you can do sound long-range planning and ensure system viability. And it also ensures that decision-making isn't influenced by shifting politics if you have that dedicated, sustained local funding source. And then just some of the other lessons that we learned from other regions as we looked at new funding opportunities is we're going to talk about this more in a couple of minutes when Bethany goes into funding, but we have seen a range of successful transit funding measures from sales tax to property tax to income tax being passed around the country to create new dedicated sustainable sources of funding for transit, both for operations and for major capital investment projects. I think this map reflects some of the key measures that have been passed around the country since 2015, and really just shows that voter approval and public support for increasing taxes to support transit has seen great success elsewhere. And then lastly, when we talk about what's driving change, it's also what we're hearing from you, from the public. Some of you may have participated in the forum we had back in May, where we had a panel of experts talking about what successful governance looks like, where funding solutions have worked around the country, and then really what some of those lessons learned might be for Baltimore. This is the results of a post-forum survey that we sent out to folks after that last public forum in May. And you can see here, 67% say more public investment is maybe the most critical issue to address. Many individuals think that transit services should be managed at a regional level. So again, looking for new alternatives. And 100% of people said local government should pay into a regional system and have a seat at the table. And again, these are reflective of the themes that came out of the chat and just the conversations that were had amongst our panelists. And I'll just grab a couple of quotes that we got from all of you as part of that feedback during that forum. Baltimore needs accessibility. The city has great medical services, museums, rail links. Employers don't care if the workers from Baltimore City or County, Howard, or Anne Arundel. And so again, just quotes from individuals who participated in the forum. We can create jobs, improve our local economies, and improve infrastructure by pulling resources and ideas together that jumpstart our transit future. And so again, lots of feedback, both looking at what's happening around the country, hearing from all of you at our first public meeting, and just summarizing our technical analysis and research that we presented to the BRTB over the last few months. Really just all of that collectively informed the, again, desire to be bold and creative in looking at new funding and governance models. And so with that, before we turn the corner to talk about funding, I'm just going to pause one more time for another poll question. If you've been with us from the beginning, you're familiar with the drill, but we encourage you and would love for you to scan that QR code or go to menti.com and enter code 554259. And if you are able to do that, just 2 questions. Again, these are anonymous. Whatever you type here, we have no idea who is providing these comments. we are really just looking for general feedback, and again, just kind of get a sense of where people's minds and thoughts are at with respect to this effort. And so maybe in part to affirm, but also to make sure we're getting this right. What are your most desired outcomes of this study? And you can just type in a short comment and it'll appear, just again, anonymous scrolling on the screen if anyone would like to make a comment this way. Similarly, feel free to type in the chat box, which we are also recording or documenting those comments. Again, we want to hear your thoughts of, as we set the stage to move into alternatives and consider new models for funding and governance, what do you hope to achieve? So this question is, what are your most desired outcomes of this study? If we are successful, what does success look like? And why make this effort to change the way things are today? We got one comment, regional coordination of transit services. Thank you to whomever shared that
Sometimes
thought.
it's harder to, you have to type more if you're on your phone. It can be a little bit difficult.
And like I said, no pressure. It's okay if you don't want to participate in this way. We are going to send these questions out after the forum. And again, we want to make sure we're getting it right. Oh, here's a few more. Thank you. So steady funding source. Oh, great. And regional governance. So again, another plug for regional system. Transportation needs to follow economics, not politics. That's great. So making the case. And create a model that aligns voters and taxpayers to have a direct stake in transit. Less dependent on politics. And I like this one, a pretty clear recommendation on what the region should do. Appreciate that you're hoping for us to come out of this process with some clarity over what some of the next steps might be. Seamless transit, great. These are fantastic, thank you. And I think I could guess what some comments might be just based on those previous comments, but one more question for everyone. What are the biggest obstacles to achieving these outcomes? I can say, in our previous conversations with stakeholders and at the BRT board meetings, I think some of the biggest obstacles are certainly how to identify new funding sources. I think political concerns have come up, but there could be something we haven't thought of. And again, it's helpful to know what some of the challenges will be moving forward so we can anticipate them and prepare our final report to be reflective of to the best of our ability addressing some of these concerns. So if you want to share any thoughts on what are the biggest obstacles to achieving the outcomes that you threw out on the previous slide, we would love to hear your thoughts. I'll give it a second in case anyone is typing. But what will be the biggest obstacle to achieving our goals and what you'd like to see? Resistance to change, great. That's true generally, right? Risk averse. Funding and political resistance, politics and systemic racism, lack of leadership, politics, that was what I suspected based on the previous slide. These are great though, and candid. So again, appreciate people's willingness to throw it out there. Yeah, political support, institutional racism. Great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on. And from there, hand it over to Bethany to talk about ideas about funding.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. It's sort of surprising that in the last slide, nobody said funding as a major obstacle to making change and implementing new governance models. So funding was something that we did take a deep dive into, and we looked at funding both for a couple of reasons. One, this idea that the region needs more investment in public transit services and systems is clear, right? Even you all, when you answered the polling questions at the beginning of the project, you prioritized, it wasn't the number one goal, but the number 2 and 3 goals were increased investment and equitable investment. And it's also the case that funding and new funding sources could really change the way that we structure and organize our governance, how we make decisions. And so what we did as part of this study is we took a real broad look at the ways that transit is funded around the country. And we looked at how these funding sources might be applied in the Baltimore region or even statewide. And so when we looked at transit funding measures, we categorized them into 3 things: major sources, secondary sources, and what we called other sources. And so the major sources are things that we could increase and raise a substantial amount of money. Of course, we need to make sure that any increase that we make is within reason, right? Like we can't have a sales tax that's 100%, but it can be a small increment of what we have already. So we did, these major sources included things like sales taxes, property income taxes, payroll taxes, fuel taxes, tolls. So things that are already in place in Maryland and could be increased marginally in order to raise some additional funds for transit. Secondary sources are things that we would probably need to package together to raise enough money. Some of them are new sources, some of them would be applied in a different way. So we looked at things like taxing Uber and Lyft rides or rideshare fees, increasing vehicle registration fees, increasing taxes on rental cars or hotels, alcohol, cigarettes, things like that. We also looked at another category of potential funding sources that sort of a catch-all, some new sources, some minor sources, and things that just have been used other places. We wanted to make sure everything was included. And so we had this long list of funding measures. And then if you can go to the next slide, we did take a closer look at them and we said, all right, is it a stable source of funding? And this, of course, was really relevant to us at this moment because we're going through a pandemic, and some funding sources were more stable and more robust than others. And so we wanted to consider that as part of sort of narrowing the list of funding measures. We also needed to take into consideration that Maryland is a relatively small state, and it definitely has a porous economy. So if we tax fuel too much, or if we increase a sales tax too much, people will cross borders and buy their goods elsewhere. Another thing that we paid a lot of attention to was equity. So who's paying and who's benefiting from the increased taxes or fees, and then how are those taxes and fees shared equally? And of course, a lot of these questions would be answered as part of the governance model. But we also, we wanted to make sure that we could raise enough money to solve the problem that we have at hand. So those were the kind of things that we looked at. And then we did have a general number if we wanted to do a little bit like a moderate growth scenario for improving transit in the Baltimore region or even statewide. And we're looking at raising somewhere between $25 and $30 million a year. Which of the taxing sources could get us there and how much? So you can see we had like a vehicle miles travel type of tax. We had income taxes. We had tolls at $1, tolls at $0.25. And if we applied that many of them statewide, they could achieve our goal of raising, or one of the goals of raising, around $25 million or something or so. So if you look at the next slide, and we again looked at many of these sources and said, if we implemented them on a regional level, could they raise that same amount of money? And many of them could, but not all of them could. And so some of them we would need to package and group together. So funding is really important. I know it's a really tricky topic because nobody likes to pay taxes or fees, but we all, but of course, we also recognize the importance of a regional transit network and in how that facilitates economic growth. It helps address equity. It provides access to opportunity. It's important for a lot of goals that the region has. And so we want to make sure that, especially as we move into kind of refining the governance models, that we consider different ways that we could raise money. And so with that, I'm going to pause, and I think Amy's got a couple more questions for you about funding.
Yep, one more about funding. So again, here's that QR code. If you missed it the first time around, these last couple of questions are really easy, quick, easy to answer, and it's where your feedback is really critical because this is really the crux where we're soliciting your input and ideas. So again, there's a QR code, or you can go to menti.com. And so this is a question: what values should drive new approaches to funding transit? Didn't want to ask you to kind of weigh or rank, specific ideas, but really more taking a step back and just thinking about the values behind a new transit funding measure. And we've broken it into a couple of buckets. So the first choice is to look at it as everybody pays, and those are taxes that again are spread across all residents and commercial businesses in the region, which would be sales tax, property tax, income tax. So again, it's spread amongst many, with a general philosophy of everybody benefits from that transit investment to support the economy and other broader goals. Or to think about it from a user perspective, so the system users pay. That could be road users, such as a VMT tax, or tolling. Gas tax would be considered a system tax, transit fares, or ride sharing tax, which is I think a popular measure that we're seeing used to generate revenues more recently in other parts of the country. And so slightly a philosophical approach, and it certainly could be a combination of both, and may need to be if the region pursues solutions that Bethany showed on the previous slides that alone would not generate enough revenue to kind of hit the target of where we see anticipated needs for funding transit in the future. So yeah, just love to get a sense of the pulse of where folks are at with respect to thinking about this from a new transit funding source being spread wide, or again focusing on a user-based system. And it looks like the majority of responses are that combination. So it could be multiple sources that include some combination of a sales, property, income tax, along with a more focused user fee, like a ride sharing, transit fares, or tolling, gas tax. I don't see any votes for a user fee or system user only. It's kind of interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. We'll move on, Bethany.
Yep, ready.
Okay.
All right. So this is what everyone's been waiting for, is seeing what the potential governance models are. So go ahead to the next slide. So we ended up with 6. The first model is to do nothing, status quo, but we did come up with 5 different ideas for how governance and funding, transit governance and funding, could be organized in Maryland and in the Baltimore region. And so I'm going to go over each of these individually, but if you could go to the next slide, Amy, what you'll see is that the first few there's the first few models, their impact and the benefits are a little bit lower, but the disruption to the existing system is also lower. So we tried to have a range of models that change the system slowly and the benefits would accrue more slowly, or things that would be more a radical departure from the way things are done, but the benefits could be greater and we might accomplish more. I will say that just to make sure everything is totally clear, we will talk a little bit about funding, but all of these models assume that MDOT MTA continues to fund transit in the Baltimore region, that those statewide transportation trust fund resources for both operations and capital continue to be invested in Baltimore regional transit and the LOTS program and MARC trains and express bus. So in no cases do we replace those funding sources entirely, and in all cases MDOT MTA remains a partner in the delivery of transit services in the Baltimore region. So again, I just wanted to remind everybody that there were kind of 2 buckets of goals, and we used these goals as we evaluated and developed the governance models. So the first bucket was about service improvements, and the second one is about changing the structures in the system. So how connections are made regionally, how we make decisions, and how we make sure that investment is done equitably. So I'm just going to spend 1 second on the MDOT MTA model, the status quo. So it is possible that we do nothing and keep doing things the way that things are operated now. Of course, as sort of Fred and Amy have framed, there are certain advantages with the system. One is that the Transportation Trust Fund, federal funds and state funds primarily are responsible for making sure that public transit happens. Some of the challenge, and so the local governments don't pay significant amounts. I mean, the LOTS programs, they do make contributions to those systems, but the core Baltimore services are funded with federal and state dollars almost entirely, and passenger revenues. And so there is an advantage with that. The disadvantage, of course, is that there's not a lot of local or regional input into how decisions are made. And so that's a structural thing that we've experimented with these different governance models. So the first one, which has the least, that is kind of the closest to the way things work, is to create a state transportation commission. There is, in fact, already a transportation commission that's available to do statewide transportation planning. But what we're proposing here is to really restructure this commission and make it responsible for overseeing and guiding investment of Maryland's transportation trust funds. Under this model, the Secretary of Transportation would report and work with the State Transportation Commission, that State Transportation Commission would make major decisions, would guide how transportation investments are made. And so it's not a big change, but there are some things that we would accomplish with this model. One is it'd be more transparency into how decisions are made, that decision making would be shared across a broader group of people. It wouldn't just be kind of focused on a handful of folks that can make decisions without really sharing a lot of that decision-making process with members of the public. But there are some weaknesses with that. And some of the big ones are that there is no real increase in the local and regional input, and it doesn't really address those service quality things, and it doesn't really focus a lot of attention or a lot of input into the way that transit investments are made and guided in the Baltimore region. So that's the first one. The second one, and you can see this blue box kind of moving through the different organization models on the right. And in this case, we're saying, okay, maybe we can create a state transit commission. The transit commission would sit below MDOT, but above MDOT MTA. And it's similar to how some of the other business units in MDOT function. Several of them have their own commissions that oversee and guide spending, and they kind of manage and represent the statewide interest. Under this model, MDOT MTA would still be the transit operator. They would continue to hold contracts for commuter rail and express bus. They would continue to guide and manage the LOTS program, but the MDOT MTA administrator would be directed by the State Transit Commission. So the Transit Commission would work directly with the administrator, help them be responsible for some of the decisions, and kind of really create some more transparency into decision making, get some more people at the table for making decisions about transit investments, and really try to make this, create a body that could advocate and really talk about how transit decisions are made. Some of the weaknesses of the model are that it really doesn't get at that problem or that core issue that the Baltimore region, there's regional input into the decision making. It's still a statewide commission, and so there would be some Baltimore representation, but this commission would not just be focused on Baltimore. Also, there is no clear ways for additional funding for funding to be increased for transit investment. You could see that over time it could lead to funding changes, but at its core, it does not increase or change funding structures. All right, so the third one, and these are kind of in a series, which you probably can see as the blue box moves a little bit down. And so a third idea that we had is creating a Baltimore advisory board. And so this advisory board would be under MDOT MTA, but would sit above the Baltimore core services. So they would guide and provide input and advice into transit operations that the MDOT MTA does. And it would only be focused on the Baltimore core services. It wouldn't have anything to do for the LOTS. It wouldn't have anything to do with MARC trains or express buses. And then the MDOT MTA administrator would be directed by this advisory board, especially only for decisions made about the Baltimore region. Again, it has some of those core things that we're looking for, which is increased transparency into decision-making and more local and regional input into decision-making. So of the first three models, this one, of course, has the most local and regional input. But of course, there's also some weaknesses with this approach. And one is that the advisory board would have its authority would be limited. It would work best if there was a statewide funding formula. So the advisory board knew for certain every year how much money it had, and it could have a lot of authority over spending that or guiding the spending and investments of those resources. And then another weakness is it doesn't directly increase funding for transit in the Baltimore region. So the fourth model is what we called the Baltimore Transit Commission. And so this is really a departure from the way things are done, and it would create a new joint state and regional transit commission that would just be focused on the Baltimore region. And so there would still, the general manager or the person who's in charge of the Baltimore core services would report to this regional transit commission. The regional transit commission would advise and direct funding. It does not necessarily directly change the existing funding structure, but you could imagine, or the Baltimore Transit Commission would have authority to ask for funds from the jurisdictions. The jurisdictions would be sitting on the Transit Commission. They could jointly decide if they needed more money, and they could start to go back and ask for additional funds. So there's a lot of reasons why we like this model. We like it because it keeps MDOT MTA as a real partner in the Baltimore Region Transit Commission, transit decisions and investments. MDOT MTA would continue to operate the transit services. So all those employees who drive buses, maintain buses, operate rail cars, do the mobility link, all of those people would continue to be employees of MDOT MTA. They would be guided by the Baltimore Transit Commission, but the existing services would continue to operate more or less in the same way. The main difference would be how decisions are made. And this centralized body, it would reflect regional decision making. It would provide some opportunities for local decision making. We've kind of at this point said, some lots may choose to join the Baltimore Transit Commission. Some could remain independent. And so this allows for us to kind of continue on the same path, but correct some of the things that are frustrating about the existing system. But there are, of course, some big challenges with this. One is if we were to, the region were to adopt this model, it does ask the state to give up a lot of authority without really sacrificing the amount of money that it is providing to support transit. So that's a big change. It's probably a difficult one. And so that is a challenge with this model. If the BTC decides to raise more money, raising those local taxes will definitely be a difficult step to take. And again, this model does require, or would work best if we had a funding formula that was really clear and that showed how money would be directed to the Baltimore region from the overall Transportation Trust Fund. And that is also not something that's easy to do. So moving along, the most radical of the models would be to create a Baltimore Regional Transit Authority. And this would be a standalone regional transit authority. It would be, the MDOT MTA would continue to be a partner in the process, and they would continue to contribute funds to the Baltimore RTA, but we would separate, it would be an independent agency. And so the general manager would not be an employee of the MDOT MTA, they would be an employee of the RTA. That's a clear difference. And then the Baltimore Regional Transit Service could contract with MDOT MTA for services. That's one way that we could continue to keep the same workers under the same contracts, or it could choose to contract with somebody else, or it could even, conceivably operate service itself. Lots, again, the lots agencies could join the RTA, or they could remain independent. But this sort of model, the RTA, even with the MDOT MTA money, it would still require new local taxes and regional taxes to support transit. So we like this for a lot of reasons. It really brings the transit services closest to home and governed, more funding from the region, operated, managed, and controlled regionally. But it is very disruptive to the way that things are done currently, especially with the service operations. The lots may or may not want to participate. Again, we're asking the state to give up a lot of authority and still provide the same amount of funding. So that is a big lift. And then, of course, raising taxes, even to support transit, are always difficult to implement. And so the next slide just kind of provides a comparison of the different governance models. And you can see as you move from left to right that the benefits start to increase. So in the case of regional coordination, for example, or improved coordination, you can see that it improves as we move to the right, as we have more local control, more regional control over the the services. Same with service improvements and increased investments. As we become more, as we transition funding and governance to a more regional level, some of those things will increase. The opportunities for regional connections, the more regional we are making decisions, the more opportunities for regional connections there will be. Likewise, the ability to diversify and expand decision-making and make more equitable decisions, investments. As we have more regional participation in the decision-making, we expect that those things would increase. And so with that, it looks like there's a handful of questions, but I know Amy has one poll or a couple more polling questions to ask, and then we can go and do some of the Q&A.
Great. Yep, so last two Menti questions, and then again, we're happy to continue the conversation with questions that you may have posed through public input. So here's the QR code, your last chance to participate, or menti.com. The code is at the top of the screen here. And these questions are really, again, we really encourage your participation to give us feedback. So the question here is which models will best meet the needs of the region? And so on the left side, these are slider questions. You know, when we think about the needs and the goals that we've talked about throughout this presentation, which of these models would have the least impact on meeting these or the most impact? And we summarized it on the previous slide, but we want to hear from you as well in terms of how much desire there is to see change and to see a change in the structure and to go after or explore new funding opportunities. In terms of least impact and most impact, which models stand out for you? So a little bit of a ranking, but also want a little bit of a reality check as well. The Baltimore Regional Transit Authority, that last model, the RTA or BARTA, as some of us are calling it, would have the most impact, and a transit commission too. And again, this is relative, right? But it helps us to kind of see your thoughts to kind of gauge what are there big gaps. You know, we know that change is incremental. We know that Model 1 is a little bit less risky, and the RTA is probably the biggest lift, but relatively speaking, could we still have an impact with some of those earlier models that keep control at the state? Or do we feel that those other models that bring it down to the regional level have a bigger impact that is worth noting? So it looks like there's some votes that say across the board, all models would have some impact in terms of helping to better meet the needs of the region, but pretty consistent with the way we presented it as well. As we go through the models, the authority comes down to the local level, and also the need for additional funding, that there's a lot of reward to come from that in terms of having an impact on meeting the goals and needs of the region. Great.
And as to Amy, just quickly, I see there's a couple questions coming in. We will get to the questions just immediately after the polling.
Yep, I'll just go to the next one. This is our last polling question, and then we'll definitely pause here for questions. So which models will be easiest to implement? And this, I think, speaks to some of the politics and funding challenges or those obstacles that you identified before. We're just curious, again, relatively speaking, how easy or difficult do you think these models will be? So if we were to pursue that State Transportation Commission, will there maybe be challenges we hadn't thought of? Or again, down to that Model 5, the Baltimore Regional Transit Authority, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, are we talking a difficulty off the charts here? Or are we maybe not giving or not thinking through something that might make it relatively less challenging? And as people are weighing in, I can leave this screen on because this is really our last slide before we go to next steps. So
A whole bunch came in at once.
There we go. Oh, so equal votes for Model 4 and 5 being difficult to implement with slightly different outcomes. And this is super helpful, again, to kind of give us that relative scale and confirm some of our assumptions and feedback to date. It's interesting that Model 4 might be more difficult than, or even the advisory board might be more difficult than the RTA. So slightly different ranking from the impact question that was asked a minute ago. Well, I can keep this open so that if people do want to weigh in, and then Don, I think you are our link, or Bethany. I don't know who can see the
I can see the questions, and I can go ahead. One of the questions that we did get is, and we're still getting some answers, but why Carroll and Harford counties are not served by either the Baltimore Transit Commission or presumably the same question for the Baltimore Regional Transit Authority. And our intention is not that they're not included, but rather that they would have the option to be included. So the way that we have developed the models right now, and they are draft, but that is that the core counties that receive service from MDOT MTA investment, so with the subway, the light rail, the bus service, the ADA service, that those core jurisdictions, which are Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, and Howard County, that they would have to be a part of either the Baltimore Transit Commission or the Baltimore Regional Transit Authority. But the other counties that are in Central Maryland or in the Baltimore region, like Carroll, like Harford, and also Queen Anne's, they could opt in or opt out. And so we weren't trying to exclude them. We were just recognizing that they may or may not see this as something that they wanted to be a part of. And especially given that being a part of it almost certainly would require some level of funding that they may or may not decide to opt in. So I hope that answers that question. And then there's a handful of comments that came in as well. One person in the audience said there's an over-reliance on sales tax because it's quote unquote easier, but it is usually a very regressive tax with the burden falling much more on persons with less incomes. And yes, I totally agree with that. There is a sense that sales taxes are easy to implement, but we agree that they are regressive. And some of the funding ideas that we tried to included some of those more traditional funding sources, but also some more creative ones. We didn't spend a lot of time going over some of those ideas, but they are in our analysis and our reporting. And then another question that, or a comment that we received was somebody saying that transit shouldn't be at odds with highways, bridges, and tunnels because the axiom is the movement of people and products where the real world is transport. So that's interesting. And then somebody else mentioned that the State Transit Commission is similar to a bill passed by the General Assembly in 2016 or so and vetoed by Governor Hogan. So been down that road before.
So yeah, passed.
Yep. And I will say, I do think that all of these governance models are really intended to be the start of the conversation, right? I mean, we're not recommending that one is better than another. We're trying to point out the strengths and weaknesses of each of the models. And then we can have, and the region can have some more conversations and do some more analysis into which one suits and fits the region the best. And again, somebody else made a comment that maybe we should call it the Baltimore Economic Regional Transport Authority. And that would my guess is that commenter also was interested in the multimodal, like, so including highways, bridges, tunnels into this regional transportation authority and
into the regional. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is not a model that we propose, and it's interesting feedback.
Yeah, definitely. Looks like you're still getting some comments or some.
Yeah. So if there's any other questions or comments that you'd like us to address, go ahead and put them in the chat through public input. And again, staff can relay them to us. We can answer them here, or again, as a follow-up to the meeting, we have I'll post again on the screen all the ways in which you can continue to provide comment. but I'll,
Yep. We've gotten none on the phone line.
okay, thanks, Tom.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just a couple more slides. I'll go ahead and round out next steps to let everyone know what's happening. And again, the comments are still open, so we'll check one last time before we sign off. And again, thank you for those of you who participated in the Menti poll, and we'll be sending these survey questions out. But as you can see, we are nearing the final stretch here in this study effort. And as I think Fred had mentioned, we have been writing technical memos and presenting on the various topics that we reviewed tonight to the BRTB board. Those technical memos, as well as the presentations to the board, are available on the BRTB website. So feel free to go back if you want to get into all of the details. And all of that work is leading towards a final report that we'll be completing and submitting by Friday, July 30th. So this effort is wrapping up at the end of July. And again, those materials will all be posted online, but really reflective of, you know, we gave the highlights tonight in terms of all the steps, and then these governance models reflecting on really the strengths and the challenges as Bethany outlined them tonight, just in more detail in the final report. And here are the ways, again, that you can continue to share your feedback with us. We aren't making a definitive recommendation, again, to be clear, but are presenting these alternatives and looking at them through the various lenses of the opportunities they present to meet the goals, the challenges, or some of the risks associated with moving in that direction, and just really teeing up the conversation for where it might go next in the region. But definitely we'll review all the comments that we received tonight and the results of the poll, and make sure that we, to the best of our ability, can address those comments and take some of those suggestions and include them in the final report.
Great. So we did get one more question, Amy, which is, does BMC leadership expect the board to make a formal recommendation from 1 through 5? And I will say, and that from the consultant team, we're not going through a process of making a recommendation. We're just laying out the models. And I don't know, Don, if you want to jump in on that as well, but this study is intended to, my understanding is it's intended to be the start of the conversation, and that some of the stakeholders and BRTB members and other regional stakeholders will continue to explore and investigate some of these options.
Yeah, that is correct. We haven't had a chance to brief the BMC board. We did brief the BRTB board, but we haven't briefed the BMC board. We expect to do that shortly at some point here in the near future. They're going to make that decision for themselves.
Thank you.
Great. Well, it's just about 7:15. We're almost up on time. If there are no final comments or questions, we'll, I think, end it there. Again, appreciate everybody who took the time to participate tonight and join us for this evening meeting and provide your thoughtful comments. And again, continue to stay engaged and provide additional suggestions or feedback as you'd like. And again, thank you. We really appreciate it, and stay tuned in the coming weeks for the final report. I think with that, we can